Hi everyone, welcome to our seminar, Speaking the Truth. East Brunswick is a predominantly white suburban town, and East Brunswick Youth Council, our executive board, is majority white and Asian. Youth Council has never been known as an activist group, but I would like for us to be. We have a privilege and a platform, and I, along with the rest of the board, intend to use it. Dismantling over 400 years of systemic oppression starts with those with privilege recognizing and breaking down the systems they benefit from. This privilege extends to many of the members of our community. So as a new generation, we should intend to use that privilege. Use it to promote Black voices in businesses. Use it to take action against racist institutions. And use it to speak out about the issues deeply embedded in our society. Talk about systemic racism, not only in law enforcement, but education, housing, healthcare, hiring, and more. As many have said, and I will repeat here today, it is not enough to not be racist. We must be anti-racist and proactively work against it to dismantle the systemic racism and eliminate its presence in all our institutions. I hope this seminar teaches you all something. Now I'd like to introduce to you all our first speaker. Durai McCray is a public speaker, writer, and youth organizer from Franklin, New Jersey.
Yes, thank you for having me. So congratulations everyone on doing your part in taking the first steps in the direction of what's right and just. And as a public speaker and a leader, you would think I have it all, but my truth is most of my life I have felt as though my existence was a crime. And growing up, I had a hard time accepting myself as a Black man. James Baldwin put it best when he said, "It comes as a great shock to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you." And this came as a great shock when, and I've said this many times before, that during this time of turmoil, I used to be Jerijah, a kid from a suburban town in New Jersey. However, somewhere along the way, I became Trayvon Martin, then I became Eric Garner, then I became Philando Castile and Timothy Rice, and now I'm Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And in the place of slavery and segregation, we bear witness to the lynching of a race of people, the social marginalization of people for their gender and sexual identification, systematic oppression, and the demonization of people because of their beliefs and orientation. We have become numb and tolerant to the perils and the evils of this world. We ignore it. We can no longer stand idly by and accept the shadows of prejudice, implicit bias, and oppression. We must wash away the stains of racism and bigotry. We must be the light that fills every dark place. We can no longer accept that same intolerance, hypocrisy, and complacency. I am angry, furious even, that all these years later, the struggles of my grandparents, who were as Black as me, are my burdens decades later. I am furious I have to watch people who look like me being arrested, charged, tried, convicted, sentenced, and executed on the sidewalk by those sworn to protect and serve. I am tired. I am tired of the lack of equity. And to be clear, we live in a country that was stolen from the native population, built on the backs of slaves, and my ancestors are the architects of this nation. Without the credit, my grandparents marched and fought for the right to vote, for my right to vote in peace. They fought for the 1965 Immigration Act so that my friends can be from many nations. Before my grandfather died, he saw a Black man become president, yet he never saw true equity and structural change in this country that this country so desperately needs. So what can we do now? What can we do? You hear the same political euphemisms: go vote, make your voices heard, which by all means is true. And because of my privilege in a democratic township, in a democratic state, and progressive state at that, it is feasible. But the most important thing you can do, especially to those that are under the voting age, is to make yourself aware and liberate yourself from the deeply ingrained ignorance and the mindset that has kept us shackled for far too long. It is not my duty to explain my Blackness, but just because of one's privilege on the basis of their race, their ethnic background, or sexual and gender identification does not mean it's not happening. Structural and systematic racism and oppression still very much exists. It's the foundation of the country that we live in. We see it in the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, the educational system, the legislative system. Need I go on? We must look ourselves in the mirror. Don't be fooled that politicians act out of the fear of consequence, not on their ill-kept campaign promises and what's right. Our criminal justice representatives are drunk off power, and big companies profit off the backs of our tribulations. Our country was founded on the principle of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, yet we stand by as Black people are denied life. People who are, quote, different are being denied liberty, and children are being robbed of the opportunity to pursue happiness. The Constitution we hold dear so clearly says, quote, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, end quote. Therefore, it is our time to act. We, the people, must do the job so many others are failing to do, especially us as young people. Thank you.
Now, our first question for Jerijah is going to be, what are the best ways as a youth to support this movement?
Well, I think the most important thing, and we've had this conversation before, is really just to educate yourself because, you know, your Snapchat stories only last 24 hours. Your repost can only go but so far. And it's kind of like, what are you reposting? What are you fighting for? You can't really be a change agent and a real pillar if you are still ignorant, right? So I think the first thing is to kind of shed that and look within yourself. And then from there, I mean, there are so many great organizations, you know, and the NAACP being one of them, you know, change.com. I mean, there are organizations or on top of organizations, websites, blogs, like the information is out there, it's accessible, it's at the click of your fingers. I think just accessing it and looking at even small incremental ways you can make a difference. Like not everybody has to go out and run for president to make a difference. It can be small and simple, but meaningful.
Do you believe that the protests could have an effect on a federal level under the current administration?
Oh, well, oof, that's a tough question. And I wish I had the right answer, but I really think that we're being seen, but it's hard to make anything more long lasting under the current administration just because we're seen as thugs and, you know, we're treated as such. You know, we've seen this time and time again. So it's a little different, but I'm a careful and cautious optimist, but I really think that if we can continue this theme and not let it die down, maybe, just maybe.
What solutions do you think America and other countries could do to end oppression against African Americans? And are there any laws or bills that you believe should be an adequate piece of reform that we should be pushing right now?
That's a loaded question. I think when you ask, you know, what laws or bills, I mean, there are so many across the world, not even just in our country, but yet we still see systemic and structural problems. So, what can we do as a country? I think the main thing is recognizing that there's a problem. Over the last few days, I've been watching the news, and so many of this administration's top officials are denying that systemic racism still exists. That's a huge problem because if you don't recognize it, how can you fix it? You know what I mean? If I go to my therapist and I have to recognize there's a problem in order for her to help me work through it, you know, so I think that's the first thing is just using our voice to recognize that, you know, there is structural problems and working, listening to people like, you know, Toni Morrison and Reverend Karen on how we can make those structural changes and us, the young people as well. So I think that's the main way is just recognizing there's a problem and coming up with sustainable and meaningful ways to change it. But our politicians are too, you know, drunk off power and are too inactive to make any meaningful changes right now. So we have to vote them out and put people in who really are about business, not, you know, just talk.
All right, we have one more question. What do you think are some of the misconceptions that stand out about this movement and that people should not be doing to support Black Lives Matter?
Well, clearly, I mean, we've been seen, you know, as, you know, thugs, you know, we've been, you know, tear gassed and, you know, brutalized in all these ways. And if you are on social media or if you go to these protests, you see that, you know, the way it's portrayed one way in the media is starkly different than how it really is. And I think that it's important to realize that it's not just, you know, violent. It's not just angry people. Yes, we are angry, but we are more passionate about what we're fighting for. And it's just the oppression of people that doesn't and shouldn't have to exist in 2020. And I think it's really important to make that distinction and keep going with it. But it really is tricky for me because I think it's even bigger than just protesting, right? Like certain people can't identify with what it means when we say Black Lives Matter because it's not their experience, right? Or they're purposefully ignorant to what it really means. Like if it doesn't exist, if I can't see it, if I can't touch it, then it must not exist. But that's just not the case. So I think stepping outside of just the traditional media, what we see on CNN or Fox News, and really looking at it from your perspective is the only way you can gain a true appreciation for what we're trying to do.
Our next speaker is one of our own from East Brunswick High School, going to senior year, so she's one of my classmates, Eniola Festus.
I wanted to come on here today to emphasize the importance of the entire Black Lives Matter movement. I believe the movement was created back in 2012, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really used to emphasize the struggles that the Black community faces in modern day America. And a lot of people turn a blind eye to those issues because they grow up in a sheltered community. Like East Brunswick is a predominantly white town with low crime rates, so we don't really see a lot of those real world issues in our town. And I believe that this is a period of change, and we should be keeping an open eye. We should be informing ourselves of everything that is going on in the world, because you cannot live your life being completely ignorant as to what's going on around you. And in this town, there is racists, there is a lot of ignorant people here, but what we really need to do is inform those people so they actually can see that there is a real problem here. I did a paper not too long ago about racism in the American justice system, and the statistics show that Black people and other minority communities are targeted at a higher rate, which means that there is technically higher crime rates in the minority communities. But I think people don't realize that minority communities are over-policed, and that is one of the main reasons why people commonly refer to minorities as criminals.
What kind of disparities do you see in privilege in our school and as well as our community and our town?
A lot of my classmates have said that they don't believe that there is racism in the justice system, and I think that's a byproduct of ignorance. And what we really need to do is educate our classmates. It's more easy to get angry at our classmates for their ignorance, but we really need to use our resources, and we have to use our voices to educate them so that they can understand. And as a Black female, I have had my share of racism in this town, and there's only so much I can do.
Is there anything in particular that frustrates you about how Black people are treated in our town?
There is a very big divide in the Black community in this town, because some of the Black people in this town are labeled as ghetto, ratchet, loud, and then there's people, the Black people like me, that people are like, oh, she's not ghetto, she's not ratchet, she's not like the other Black people. And those things are microaggressions, whether people like to admit to that or not. But I think that ideology really needs to go, and people have to understand that they cannot just place all Black people under that same standard.
How do you think we draw the line between overt and covert racism, particularly in casual conversations and in school?
The main way to combat that is to just speak out and call people out, because a lot of people in this town use racial slurs, and I believe that they don't realize how they're offending their classmates. So if we all just inform, if we all just speak out, I believe that things will change.
When it comes to our school and our community, what changes would you like to see be made?
I want to see a better sense of unity, because, like I said before, there is a large divide in this town, and if we could all just come together, if we could all just point out the issues at hand, then I think our school community would be a lot better.
I'd like to introduce to you all Alefiya Presswala, who's going into her junior year and is a volunteer for Students Demand Action East Brunswick.
Thank you for having me. So I'm basically on here to talk about what the model minority myth is and how it affects the relationship between Black communities and Asian communities. And so I would like to start off this discussion by mentioning the murder of George Floyd, may he rest in peace. We now know that there were a total of 4 police officers involved in his death, and one of these cops was an Asian man. So as an Asian person myself, when I saw this, I felt ashamed. I felt kind of guilty in a weird kind of way. And I think that a lot of other Asians also felt the same way, because when I started going on Instagram and people were first starting to talk about this, I saw a lot of Asian people saying, oh, we don't claim this cop, we don't want him, he's not one of us, like blah, blah, blah. And the thing is that we do have to claim this cop, and we have to recognize that this was an Asian man who is complacent in a Black man's murder. And we have to recognize that there is so much anti-Blackness in the Asian community, and we have to ask ourselves why. So to answer that question, let's go back to the 1960s, to the Civil Rights Movement in America. Black people were fighting for the end of segregation, job rights, equal opportunities, and they were fighting for equality that wasn't based on race. The movement brought attention to the need for an immigration reform, and in 1965, America changed its immigration policy from a national quota to an immigration policy that prioritized immigrants who were considered to be more intelligent, or immigrants who were considered to have special skills or high educational achievements. And a lot of these immigrants who were considered to have these high achievements were Asians. And basically what I'm saying here is that if you're an Asian American whose family immigrated to America during or after the 1960s, you owe it to Black people and their movement. You owe a lot of your privilege in America to Black people. And what I mean by privilege, because it's not the same as white privilege, is that right off the bat, right when Asians started moving to America, the government had already declared that they were intelligent and of high education. Right off the bat, they were already favored for a higher success rate and a higher status in America. The second form of privilege is what we call today the model minority myth, which is basically this idea that Asians are this perfect, kind of submissive, law-abiding citizens. And part of this idea is also that Asians are very hardworking, specifically more hardworking than Black people. And basically what this minority myth did is that it put out this message that Asians are the superior minority because they supposedly have that higher status, and that they should see Black people as lesser to them. And today, a lot of Asians still use this as an excuse for the way they treat Black people. And if you think about it, you can see this model minority myth everywhere. For example, you will always hear the stereotype of the crazy Latina woman or the angry Black man, but there's no such stereotype for Asian women. Even on TV, they will make the Asian the nerdy or the intelligent side character who's more quiet, while the Black girl has sass or is more loud. In simple terms, the model minority myth is just Asians being brainwashed by the government and the media into thinking that they have a high status or good education and success because they're Asian, and simply because they're Asian and the better minority, and that Black people do not because they're Black and don't work as hard as them. When in reality, there's a system in place that favors Asians over other minorities and works against Black people in many situations. I could go on about how this model minority myth is so so wrong and so false, but the real question is, how do we begin to dismantle this myth and the anti-Blackness in the Asian community? So first off, you have to reject the idea that you're a model minority. The myth literally only exists to pit people of color against each other for the benefit of white people. It's an excuse for white people to compare Asians to other minorities when a discussion of oppression arises. For example, they might say, Asians are successful and doing good and they're minority, Black people are just lazy. The real answer is that there's a form of systemic racism in America that hurts Black people and has been hurting Black people. The model minority myth is just an excuse to shift the accountability from the oppressor to the oppressed. Do your own research and learn the ways that you, as an Asian, have benefited from Black oppression. Start by calling out your family members when they say something that's anti-Black, and confront your friends when they're using a slur that they shouldn't be. Take note of the things that you enjoy that are there because of Black people. This includes art, books, music, clothes. Appreciate the Black culture around you, and most importantly, listen to Black people. Not only ask them how they're doing, but learn how to amplify their voices instead of talking over them, because this movement is about them and not you. I'll end with this. If you're an Asian person, you can't truly celebrate your Asian success in America without standing up for and supporting Black people. They helped you get where you are, and their lives matter just as much as yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Alefiya. We are now going to go on to our next speaker, who is Reverend Karen from the Lost Souls Memorial Project, We've worked with her before at Youth Council, and we absolutely love her, so we think you'll enjoy hearing her as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here and to be able to learn from the prior panelists and the ones who will follow after me. I want to start with some recent words from one of America's most powerful and skillful public intellectuals, Michelle Alexander, who wrote on Jim Crow and how it still exists for us. That was 10 years ago, but she just wrote in the New York Times this: "In part, we find ourselves here for the same reasons a civil war tore our nation apart more than 100 years ago. Too many citizens prefer to cling to brutal and unjust systems than to give up political power, the perceived benefits of white supremacy, and an exploitative economic system. If we do not learn the lessons of history and choose a radically different path forward, we may lose our last chance at creating a truly inclusive, egalitarian democracy." In the op-ed that she wrote, she didn't offer a roadmap, but she did give some compass points for a possible future where we have a democracy that isn't rotting because it was based in white supremacy and the genocide of indigenous folks, but could emerge possibly from the flames of today into a new possibility of Phoenix rising. And she said, we must face our racial history and our racial present. These two are never separate. We must reimagine justice, and we must fight for economic justice. And then when she said that, she referenced how Dr. King made that connection. So I'm Karen Johnston. I'm the minister at the Unitarian Society, and I am also here, thank you. I'm a proud member of the Lost Souls Public Memorial Project, which I do that work with one of the other panelists, Toni Hendricks, who you'll hear from later. And even though my first name is Karen, I have spent decades as a white woman now in middle age working to not be that Karen of pop culture right now, right? Because as a person who belongs to a cultural group that is assigned white, is assigned privileges that I do not consent to and I do not intend, they benefit me, right? And so I, like many people who share my social location, are socialized to go in that direction. But I am proud to be a part of communities, including my congregation, where we have a sign on Tisus Lane that says, "Love is love, Black Lives Matters," and we've had it there for several years. It's part of how my faith witnesses and says that however white supremacy culture exists, we do not want to be a part of it, and we will do that thing where it's not that we are not being racist, we will be anti-racist. I want to say, I heard so many wonderful things. I know like what to do as a white person. For me, one of the most important, powerful things has been if someone from a marginalized identity tells me that my words or actions have caused harm, my response needs to be, thank you. It's a gift that you were willing to tell me, an act of trust, because you didn't have to. And it's to check whatever defensiveness has been socialized to rise within me. That is one of the ways that I can stay in right relationship with folks who are given less privilege in the system. The Lost Souls Project is something that is totally related to East Brunswick. It's a part of East Brunswick history, and I believe it's part of our present in understanding why there are only 4% African-American population in East Brunswick. What is the story? How is it that has come to be the truth in this part of New Jersey when it's not true in other places? And what can we learn from that? Lost Souls is about a Middlesex County judge who was corrupt and who used his powers to sell away 150, 180 African Americans, some of whom were free, some of whom were enslaved, one who was as young as 2 days old, into permanent slavery by sending them to Louisiana and Mississippi. We are about centering the lost souls, the names of the people we have recovered who had that experience, centering them, centering Black members of local communities so that they really are taking the lead on how we remember those folks. I'll just finally say, because I know my time is up, is that one of the ways that I have recently asked myself and my congregation is how to engage and understand this rising call to reimagine justice, to reimagine policing. I know I see in myself, how could that be? But I'm willing and I'm going to teach myself, and I'm asking my congregation to do the same. And I welcome questions.
All right, thank you, Reverend Karen. Even as a Jew, I love to hear what you say, and I think putting aside religious differences is a great part of this movement. One of our questions from the live chat is, can you further explain about the assigned privileges and how we can eliminate this now and in the future?
I think that the development of what it means to be Black and what it means to be white is something that is a historical social construction, right? And so, and with that comes privileges. And what we can do about them, before they are gone, before the system is upended, I believe that the privileges that I have need to be used as a superpower in order to speak up when it might cause more risk or harm to my colleagues or friends of color, and to take risks where I might feel uncomfortable. It means that instead of centering white voices and white thought thinkers, that I look to communities and voices of color, even if at first it doesn't make sense to me, to recognize that that difference might come from my white socialization.
How have you seen people utilize the Bible or religion itself for racist purposes, and what do you recommend we do about it?
Dr. Howard Thurman tells a story of how his grandmother, who was born enslaved, loved the Bible, and he would read it to her as a young child when she could not read because she was blind. And but there was one piece from Paul that she would not allow him to even look at or touch, and he didn't understand that as a young person. And then later, as he became a theologian, he read it, and it was the piece of Paul that said basically to slaves to follow your masters. So there are so many ways in which the Bible has been a comfort to folks, but also been used as a tool of white supremacy. And that's true in terms of also as a tool of discrimination against people who understand themselves to be queer, right? It's a tool. All scriptures, no matter what religious tradition they come to, and they can be used in multiple ways. I believe houses of worship, rooted in their own traditions, need to find the power within that tradition to speak truth to power, to know that there are many ways to understand that there's not just one entrance into Judaism or into Christianity or even into Unitarian Universalism, which is my faith, and to use that as a tool to understand and be rooted in speaking truth to justice. I believe making a public stand supporting Black Lives Matters. I have to say 3 weeks ago, that would have felt like more of a risk, but more and more folks are taking that chance. But and then doing the work, and I heard someone say, don't just say the slogan, do the work underneath, right? That will bring you to understand why your experience of a system, if you're white, is not the experience of someone of color.
When you talk about reimagining the police, what do you think can come from it, and what changes would you like to see be made?
Before I was a minister, I was a social worker. And some of the first social work I did was working with folks who had been spent much of their adult life living in a mental ward, right, a hospital. And in the 1980s, many of those folks found new life in community settings where they didn't need to have that level of constriction. We find that there are people who are in prison who have mental health issues, who have addiction issues, and somehow we have criminalized homelessness, we have criminalized addiction, when that does not have to be the only way that we address those problems. And in fact, when we address those problems, things get worse. Our police officers do not want to be social workers with guns, right? They want to be police officers. So let's explore what's possible in that way.
Thank you, Reverend. We ended with excellent timing. So now we get to move on to our next speaker. She is also another high school classmate of mine from East Brunswick, Ania Prince.
Thank you guys for having me. I just wanted to start with my experience as being a Black girl in a mainly white town, a mainly white school, and I also play volleyball, so being on a mainly white volleyball team for 4 years now. I've grown up, my mom has always taught me to put 100% or more into what you do, because you have to prove yourself over and over again because of the color of your skin. And I've had that mindset since I was a young girl. And sometimes being in school and teachers putting you down and saying stuff, you could lose that mindset and just like fall behind and get swept under the rug. So having that, always having that mentality, like really gave me strength in how I am today, and to be able to speak out and be strong, because it's very powerful to go on and teach my kids that as well. My skin color has affected me and my family for as long as I know. We've gone to volleyball tournaments in Florida and places, and my mom has told me that white people have clenched their purse when she has sat down next to her. They feel uncomfortable, and we go into stores and we get followed. And people have crossed the other side of the street just so they wouldn't have to pass us. And I just feel that now it shouldn't be acceptable for people to act that way, because you're degrading another race, and it's very, it's wrong. And I feel that going forward, people really need to educate themselves more, and just need to be aware of how their actions are, how you're making the other race feel. And in school with the racial slurs, and just laughing it off and not really saying something, you don't know that it's disrespectful and degrading to that part of that race. I posted something on Instagram, and I think this is very powerful, about when a Black woman or a man walks into a room, they should not feel intimidated with all the white people or another race, Asian, another race in the room. Hold your head up high, because you belong there. You worked hard to get there, so you belong to be in that classroom. You belong to get the education that you worked for and you pushed for. So don't let anyone put you down for being, just because of the color of your skin and how you are portrayed by the world. And I know Eniola was talking about this there's two different types of Black people in our especially in our town, and you are either called loud and ratchet, or you're called just normal Black, and you're like, you could socialize with your white friends, and you could socialize with the other ones, and that's where I'm under. And I feel like that is wrong, and everyone shouldn't be there shouldn't be two types, and people will get pushed out because of they're that type of Black, loud. So I feel that if schools could change how they are looked at, and I think that we could start with the community as well as how we're looked at as well.
Our next speaker is Natalie James, who is a video producer and activist.
So I want to tackle the different ways that we can protest, and specifically how we can protest peacefully. So first, what is a protest, right? It's a statement or an action expressing disapproval or objection to something. So just knowing that changes the way we perceive protesting, because we naturally associate this with going out and marching with picket signs, when in fact there are many ways that we can approach showing our disapproval or objection to something. So this is especially important to know in the time of COVID, because not only do we want to protest peacefully, but we need to take into consideration this world of social distancing we're living in now. The purpose of a protest is to raise awareness and put social pressure on others in power to create sustainable change. This is usually meant to make people feel uncomfortable, and certainly isn't meant to be convenient for anyone. So if this is something that you're passionate about, it's something that you need to make time to do, because in order to have a successful, peaceful protest, it takes a lot of organizing and commitment. And it takes people who are in it for the long haul, not just people looking for something to do so they feel better about themselves in the short run. Change is a lifelong commitment, and you need to know your goals and you need to be clear about them. This way, you know that the people who are supporting you also align with your goals. So there are many different kinds of protests. You can march. In this particular case of Black Lives Matters, you can host a vigil. You can do some kind of visual display. You can form some kind of organization, and you can do my favorite thing, which is hit them in their pockets and boycott. So I love boycotting because it's a super effective way, in this case, to show the power of the Black dollar and also lift Black-owned businesses or businesses that support our cause. A lot of businesses generally try not to take a political stance. So the ones that do know what they are signing up for. So you shouldn't feel guilty about not patronizing a place that, I don't know, supports something that you don't support. This means even though you love Chick-fil-A, if you care about gay rights, you cannot eat there. Even though you love Taco Bell, if you want Trump out of office, you cannot eat there. And even though you love your grande soy mocha lattes from Starbucks, if you believe their employees should be able to wear BLM stuff to work, you cannot give them your money. Money is one of the most powerful things in this country, and it is a good way to safely and peacefully protest a subject. So before you spend your money, do some research and some fact checking to make sure that you're patronizing places that support your protests. There's a Facebook page called Black Dollar International that people are using to support Black businesses, and it's a great way to see what options are out there and get started. Just make sure you fact check everything. As for marching, when you are helping organize a march, you have to make sure you are beating into other people's heads that no matter what, they cannot be violent. These are the hardest protests to manage because there are so many people, and opposition forces will infiltrate and incite violence. You have to publicly denounce that violence. You have to separate yourself from those who support it, and you have to be smart about how you manage the crowds. We recently did a protest called Banners for Justice, and we got a bunch of people in Highland Park to get together and create banners to hang out in front of their houses in support of Black Lives Matters. So this was successful because we got sponsors and support from the town, police, Rutgers, and the community, and we heavily enforced social distancing. It was also sustainable, meaning that people put banners in front of their houses so the protest didn't just end when the event ended. They could essentially keep those banners up forever and in support of the movement. So we were very careful about who we picked to organize and to speak. We even encouraged people to sign waivers and had rules about specifically not using supplies to create banners that encourage harm against anyone. This includes police, because you have to remember, as much as you hate police right now, we want reform. So you have to clearly state your goals. And if one of those goals is peace, you cannot also enforce narratives of absolutes. You have to remember that there are good and bad people on all sides, and if you want to change policy or if you want police reform, you have to be willing to engage with the good cops and rational people on the other side. Narratives of absolutes are polarizing, and they do not offer a bridge to educate. Ignorance is born from a lack of education. So if the goal is change, then you have to be open to having tough conversations with people who do not agree with you. This will help facilitate peace. Be strong and steadfast in your convictions. Whatever peaceful protest you decide to do, you must commit to fully. this energy will naturally bring more people into the fold because we are living in a time where people truly want direction from opinion leaders on how they can get involved and help. And finally, vote, 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 vote. Not just in the presidential election, but also your local elections, because that's what affects you the most. And do your research and vote for candidates that support your views. Hold your local candidates and politicians up to the standards that you want for your community.
How can we best differentiate between a business just trying to be woke and one that is actually trying to effect change? And are there any major companies that you think legitimately support the movement?
That's tough. You can't really tell, right? Because everybody has a PR company, and everybody, to a lot of people, this is a fad, what's going on. And they just want to be on the right side of history, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it reflects their beliefs. So in the bigger picture of things, the real goal here is to specifically support Black businesses, because that's the issue right now, right? Black growth and Black power and Black lives mattering. So that's an easy way to make sure that your money is going towards people who support, because they are those people. And then with bigger picture things, I mean, you can do your research, and if obviously a company is not supporting it, then that's not a company that you want to support, but you want to put the pressure on other companies to switch and demand more from them. So like, it's not enough to just say, I stand with Black Lives Matter. Look into how they actually are treating their Black employees, okay? Do they have Black leadership at their companies? Are they doing any social justice programs to help support the Black community? And then this can be applied to any kind of protest that you're doing, whether it's gay rights or civil rights or environmental rights, etc.
How do we make sure that this doesn't just remain a fad? So how can we protest and support Black businesses and keep the movement going for long term?
The long-term way to do it is to vote and to also, continue to support Black businesses. You have to you can't just make a choice and then say, okay, well, I bought my groceries from this Black-owned supermarket today, so I'm good for the year. You have to continue to do it. And you have to get involved in your primary elections, or, helping to support candidates before it gets to that party versus party thing, because you want to make sure that within whatever party you're supporting, that you're holding whatever candidate gets that seat to certain standards, and you have specific things that you're looking for them to do, and they know that, and that the community is also building them up to address these specific issues within the Black community, because the Black community means different things. It might mean something different for Highland Park or East Brunswick than it means for New York or, I don't know, another big city.
Now we're moving on to our next speaker, Julian Hector, who is a student leader in Franklin High School fighting for racial justice and equality. And he has actually made a request to speak for the duration of his time, so that way he can fully explain to us what's going on.
I wanted to thank you guys for putting this platform together for, people of color and Black people to talk about their experiences. And I want to thank you guys who are attending for listening. That's the first step in becoming an ally, coming here and listening to us and understanding your role and how you can help us. So I wanted to start this off by talking about education and the barriers in education that we see when we're talking about African American history. There was a bill that came out in New Jersey about 18 years ago, the Amistad Law, that required that all schools teach African American history. Yet we don't see this in our curriculum. This is not reflected in our English curriculum. We're not exposed to any Black authors talking about racism. And I feel like that in itself is a problem. So I wanted to share with you guys today an essay that I wrote about one of the Black authors that have really impacted my life. When I was younger, I wasn't really exposed to a lot of Black authors who talked about racism. Obviously we were all exposed to Martin Luther King Jr., but, as I continued on with my high school career, I realized there were so many other authors, people like Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, August Wilson. And one of the main authors that really changed my life and changed the way that I thought about race was James Baldwin. He really stuck with me. And one of his books was called The Fire Next Time My Dungeon Shook. And in this book, he writes a letter called A Letter to My Nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation. So I wrote an essay on this letter, and I wanted to share this essay with you to hopefully help you guys understand the Black experience. And, even though this essay was written 50 years ago, it still pertains to today. Racism is built into the DNA of America. As long as we turn a blind eye to the pain of those suffering under its oppression, we will never escape those origins. 50 years earlier, James Baldwin conveys a similar message in his essay, A Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of Emancipation, where he writes to his nephew, James, warning him of the oppression and self-hate that has plagued his family for years. He emphasizes not only that the way to escape the oppression is to truly value himself and not how society in white America views him. So James Baldwin opens up this letter by expressing that he's begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times more. That really stuck with me because, you can see how much time and effort he put into writing this letter for his nephew. He then begins to describe his nephew in comparison to his brother. By evoking the faces of his brother, he calls to attention the ever-present importance of family history and lineage. When discussing these comparisons, he calls his brother tough, moody, and quick to appear truculent, in order to avoid being perceived as soft or weak. Baldwin thinks that James has inherited this from his grandfather, who was bitter because he really believed what white people said about him. Due to this, the old man became overly holy. Again, calling upon James' forebears, Baldwin holds his own father up as an example of the Black man defeated by white authority. Believing what white people said about him, Baldwin's father retreated to religious life, the church ultimately functioning as another form of authority. What Baldwin, I think, is really trying to establish here is that this sense of oppression and authority has stayed in Black people's lives for so long that they've begun to search for it themselves and become desensitized to it itself. James, on the other hand, he is part of a different generation, a generation that originated in a new city and can more realistically assess these issues of race and oppression. And he warns his nephew and the Black community not to follow in the paths of their forebears and not to fit into those same stereotypes. He ends his paragraph saying that you can only be destroyed by believing that you are what the white world calls a nigger. Growing up in a society where they were viewed as inferior, even worthless, created such a hostile and mentally degrading environment to grow up in. I think James Baldwin's intent for the Black community is to provide them a reflection of what they've become, as well as make them aware of the dangers of having this mindset. He takes it one step further by addressing that this is a crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen. For while nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know or do not want to know it. He claims that white America and the ignorance in their role in the oppression of others is to blame for the systemic hate that we see. This false sense of innocence and privilege created by white people's unwillingness to recognize the harm that they and their ancestors have inflicted on people of color continues to ravage our society today. And as long as this outlook continues, white people will be able to carry on with their destruction. He states that but it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. I think this quote was incredibly provocative, and by Baldwin stating this, he devises a new perspective for white America and the audience to examine. The fact of the matter is that white people and white America has unwittingly placed the Negro in a position that is so untenable. And I think that this situation was not created through the malice of present white citizens, but through the innocent oversight on their part. The majority of the population to this day is so used to the way that things are that they're essentially unaware of the struggles that African Americans exist and that African Americans face. They are trapped in a history for which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So, as he goes on to talk about how, we need to understand that it would be bizarre for white people to wake up one day and realize that equality is attainable. He indicates that it would be crazy for them, and that it would it would be like an immovable pillar moving itself. He resonates with white America and highlights that to have change, this would require them to abandon their standard of normal and risk their security being shattered. So he tells Black America to be aware of this and to realize that white America, their sense of comfort has just been cracked, and they must find a way to make themselves fit into a puzzle where equality is ideal. He tells Black America that they must look past their grievances and take on the responsibility of using love to educate those who are ignorant. And I think that this shows that there must be a mutual understanding between both white America and Black America to get the change and equity that we see moving forward. Baldwin, in the last paragraph, ties it all back to the central message to his nephew. He claims that in order to survive in such an environment, young James and those of his generations have to be strong, drawing from the love of those of his race that they bestowed upon him. He asserts that because his nephew is Black, and for no other reason, American society has deemed him as worthless, set limitations on his ambitions, and has conditioned him to make peace with mediocrity. This establishment has placed boundaries on what he can do, where he can live, and who he can marry. And I think his message is loud and clear. Though these assertions will no doubt be called exaggerations by white America, every African American needs to only look on his experiences to know that they're true. The workings of society has deliberately constructed to make African Americans believe what white people say about them. But these conditions testify not only to the Black man's inferiority, but to the white man's inhumanity and fear. And I think that it's remembering this, that young James and Black people today can break free of these shackles and grasp the opportunities that are present for Black America and for people today. I think this letter was really, really powerful for me to read because, as a Black man growing up, I internalized some of the implicit biases and implicit racism that I faced. And I think that this letter really makes you think of the reality and the roots of this hate. And I think that it's ignorance. I see this letter as a precedent for families of color to have the racism conversation with their children. It's a conversation that's not easy, but it's a must for Black people to succeed in life. And having a better understanding of the challenges that they may face will help them get into a path to be successful in life. This letter explains everything with loving words and inspires you to be proud of your heritage. It explains that even today, the need to eradicate ignorance and educate society has not dissipated, and it's still important. And I think it overall explains the fact that it is important considering and understanding both perspectives to truly create change. And this letter really encompasses hope, and I think that was the intent overall.
Next up, we have Miss Toni Hendricks, who is the third Vice President and Chairperson of Community Outreach for the New Brunswick Area NAACP, and she was a huge help for me when first starting to put this event together because she was one of the people nice enough to be very open when talking with me and didn't ignore my emails.
Thank you, Jordan. And I have made it a practice never to ignore outreach from the young people in my community, and I never will. And I'm a fan of the bakers anyhow, so there. So, okay, let me start first by acknowledging, thank you, Jerijah, for participating. I appreciate the fact that when we reached out to you, that you stepped up to the plate. And my partner in crime, Rev Karen G Johnston, many, many, many good love. Now, to all of you on this call, this is going to be challenging for me to take all the notes that I've made about your questions, how best to go about framing my discussion in such a condensed period of time. But I'm going to do my best to honor and respect the time frame that it was given to us. So one of the things that I want to start with is something that I feel personally is very, very important to address. I've done it with every single speaking opportunity that I've had for many years. That is to set the framework and the context for helping you understand from a historical perspective really what is meant by institutional structural racism and how did it appear in the DNA of this great country that we live in. And one of the young speakers referenced the Amistad teaching curriculum. I'm not sure if it's even part of that, because it's going to raise a kind of concern for some people to actually hear what I'm about to say. So I am not going to quote very much from the actual readings so that I can protect against that. But when we think about the formation of this country in 1776, there was a document, an important document called the Declaration of Independence, that one of the primary authors of the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, as a historical person in our country, is considered to be a very important learned scholar who produced many writings, not just his participation in the Declaration of Independence and the government of this nation. So it's important for us to understand what was going on at the same time that we were structuring our country then. Right after he penned the Declaration of Independence, he put together what is considered to be the only complete book that he ever wrote. He did a lot of papers that can be accessed, but there was a book, and it was called Notes on the State of Virginia. This work was published somewhere around the time frame of 1781, and it was a definitive book that he put together to help the country understand what it would take to create statehood and what it would take to create a government, and those things that needed to be considered when going about developing our great country. There is a section in these notes, it's Query 14, that had to address the quandary of the Declaration of Independence stating that all men are created equal. And the fact that in our great country at that time, that is not true. The Native American or the indigenous people of this land weren't even considered human beings. They were referred to as savages. The slaves that were here in our country at that time were not considered human beings. They were considered chattel. So for those of you who want to do more research and understand the differences in slavery, understand that the slavery of this country was chattel slavery, which means that human beings were not considered to be human beings. They were considered to be something like a horse or a pig or a plow. They were ownership, they were property. So we had this conundrum because he knew one of the things that a government had to do to be a government was to have a systematic way of allocating power and resources. And because our country was formed of many, many different states, the allocation of power and financial resources became something that they had to grapple with. So it was decided at that point that the United States would allocate power and resources based upon counting the human beings that lived in geographical boundaries 10 times a year, the decennial census, which, by the way, remind your parents or yourself, if you're head of household, complete your census for 2020. So in doing so, he said, oh, we have a problem, because the definition of chattel slaves was that they weren't human beings. So there is a whole writing, which I won't read to you. You can read it yourselves if you want to. You can Google it very easily, because it has some very disturbing language in it, where he puts forward an assertion about how, even though the Negro is considered part of the human race, there are very specific physical and mental attributes which made them inferior as a race, and therefore started the political definition of racism. But I want to read to you the conclusion of doing that so that you understand this is how deep embedded in this country racism against Black people are. The conclusion is that the real distinctions which nature has made and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. These are assertions that were put forward when this nation was being founded. And as a result of making this distinction, when the first census was taken in 1790, not long after, then the way you were considered to be counted in the census was if you were a white person, you were a person. You were counted as a whole person. If you were a Native American or an indigenous person, you weren't counted at all. If you were a Black American at the time, there was still this need for inferiority, so therefore you were counted as 3/5 of a human being. So for those of you who come from Black families and your parents or grandparents are grappling with, why should I complete the census? Say, because I don't want to be 3/5 of a human being anymore. Okay, so fast forward. A lot happened during then, the Civil War, Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1909, 60 people got together in New York City and formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known today as the NAACP. What were they responding to? They were responding to the fact in our country during all these convulsions of the Civil War and Jim Crow and rights and things of this nature, that there was this really horrible thing that was going on in our nation, which we can equate to the terminology you're hearing now regarding George Floyd, and that is lynchings. So these wonderful citizens got together and says, we've got to do something about this. You know, it was a final act that took place in Springfield, Illinois, that just was too much. Of those 60 people, and I want you to listen to this, East Brunswick, because I don't want you to overly defend the fact that you have very few Black Americans. I want you to understand that you still play a role. And this is why I want you to hear this. The original formation of the NAACP, the original 60 people that formed that organization, only 7 of them were Black. The rest of them were not Black people. But they stood up and they understood that this was a time that change needed to occur. And very importantly, they understood in order for change to occur, they had to attack the power system and the financial system. And by the way, kudos to Rev Johnston's organization, because one of her leaders at the time was an original member of the NAACP in 1909. Okay, so power and money. So now let's fast forward to the 1960s. I cut my teeth during the 1960s civil rights movement. I don't want to spend this time talking about it, because if there's any part of our history of civil rights that is discussed, it is that period of time. Instead, I want to point out that after the 1960s, as you moved into the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, there was a pause. Even though there was just as much racial disharmony, racial inequality occurring in our country, there was a pause in terms of movement. Now, I don't want to speculate on that because it's not for me to speculate. I continued to work during that period of time. But why I'm bringing it up is that I am so proud of you all, because 2020, you are bringing us out of that pause, and you are putting us right back on the track of having a civil rights movement that actually accomplishes something in this country. And you all need to understand that what can you do? You're a part of it already. You're having this conversation. You're having people from all different walks of life as part of this conversation. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit more very specific about that. Some of the comments I want to make sure that you understand the answers to in terms of what actually is going on. You brought up the fact somewhere in the chat room that are there specific laws or things that can be done in order to address this? The answer is yes. This country is a series of laws. It's called the Constitution. Law enforcement agencies don't make law. They enforce law. Everything Reverend Karen said, about mental health and homelessness shouldn't be a law enforcement issue is 100% correct. So the NAACP is on record. We do not support defunding police forces. That word defund, we do not support. This is not about defunding law enforcement. It's about understanding that the law enforcement budget is part of a larger budget and that those monies should be allocated more appropriately rather than dealing with our societal issues that have nothing to do with law enforcement, placing it on the backs of our law enforcement folks. So those of you who are using the term defund and wondering why you're not getting any oxygen out of the civil rights organizations, that's the reason why. It's not the answer. Changing our policies, and that's the answer. So I wanted to bring that point out to you carefully. The other thing I wanted to address was there is, earlier today, I was on a video conference with Senator Booker. I actually was before him his setup person. And one of the things he reminded us about is the bill right now that Congress has put forward, which is what we are in support of for law enforcement. It's the accountability bill. It's the bill now that's saying, here's what we need to have change. It is not about defunding. So become familiar with that and make sure that you understand what's in there, because those are the rights that you should be focused on and fighting for. There was some conversations earlier about organizations that are they just getting woke, or are they just jumping on the bandwagon, or who really are those businesses and companies out there that are doing this work that we should be supporting? Oh my goodness, I see our esteemed Congresswoman joining. So Jordan, if you need to manage my time, feel free to do that, because I always defer to the Congresswoman when her time is an issue. But I want to point out to you that there are institutions that their track record speaks for itself in terms of being committed to this, to the equality and all. And you are smart people. You know how to go about finding that out. Miss Natalie, she gave you a very good advice about looking at, how are they structured, what's their leadership like? What is their commitment when nobody's looking? But I want to highlight something in particular, two things in particular that occurred that we should pay attention to. NASCAR removing the Confederate flag from what they're doing, and A&E removing from their lineup their most watched, most profitable programming, which is all the Cops Live type of programming. This is a demonstration of really walking the walk, because NASCAR has one black driver. That's it, just one. And most NASCAR races don't occur in what's considered to be traditional blue states. So that's a really big deal that we all need to be paying attention to. And when we look at A&E, eliminating some of their most profitable programming, that's finances. So power and finances, these are the things you should be focusing on. And that's why your vote is important. But it's not just your vote, it's your intelligent vote. It's understanding that putting people like Congresswoman Watson Coleman back in place. Why are you doing that? You're doing it because of her stand on policies that are important to you. Make sure you understand that. I'm going to close with a couple of things. One is a lot of you are school-aged children. And forgive me for calling you a child, but I have a granddaughter who's 26 years old. So to me, I say it lovingly. Understand that the state that you live in is the fourth most segregated school system in the United States. There are students, white students, who go 12 years without sitting in the classroom with a Black instructor or a Black student. There are Black students who go through 12 years sitting in a classroom without a white instructor or a white student. And then juxtapose that to the fact that coming very soon, we will be a non-white majority nation. This has got to end. We have to fix this. We can't have you sitting for your formative years in an educational environment that doesn't allow you to really understand and interact with the very people that you have to when you come out of school. So many of those questions you were asking each other, they were painful to see because you're not exposed to each other. And I'm going to end, I just want to end with saying, I'm proud of all of you, but you have to continue to work. It's not about just having this conversation. It's about being courageous and having those conversations every day, both at home and out in public. And I'm not asking you to get into any type of physical confrontation. You can say things like, I appreciate your opinion, but can I offer you mine? And remember that Nelson Mandela, what kept him motivated and ready to rock and roll when he came out of prison was the poem Invictus. And the last two lines are, I am the captain of my soul and the master of my fate. And those words apply to you also. Thank you for giving me this time. I've got to defer back to Jordan so she can introduce the Congresswoman.
Yes, thank you. Hopefully, since we reserve some extra time for things like this, we will let you answer questions that we have gathered from your wonderful speaking after everyone else.
I'll be here.
Now, some of you may have noticed that we have a new speaker, and I'm hoping many of you recognize her name and title. She needs no introduction, but this is Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate being here with you today. And you have no idea how much I appreciate the fact that you've given up this perfectly beautiful, sunny, 75-degree Saturday afternoon to do this. I had the benefit of listening a little bit to Sister Hendricks as she was sharing with you some historical perspective and giving you the kind of encouragement to keep it on, keep going on, and making our communities, our state, our country even better. I had a hard time getting on, actually, but then that's just sort of my challenge, being of my generation and having to work virtually. I'm glad to see Officer Wright on the call and Reverend Johnston and each and every one of you. This is a moral moment, and it has come out of a very sad occasion. And I tell everyone who speaks so much to the impetus, this moment, the impetus, the diverse interactions, the kind of persistent commitment we see to social justice and enough is enough and making the changes that we need to make. Yeah, all of that is really important, but Mr. Floyd would rather be alive. And I don't ever want us to depersonalize this moment, because if given the opportunity, of course, he would have loved to have seen the change take place, but not at the expense of his life. And the same thing for Breonna Taylor. And let us not forget that at the same time we're dealing with what we saw happening to Mr. Floyd in front of our eyes, which I guess is the most stunning thing we've ever seen in our lives. Breonna Taylor also lost her life in a situation that never should have occurred. There is a legislative response to what we've seen. This legislative response has been spearheaded by the Congressional Black Caucus. We're taking the lead on these issues. It consists of several different bills that are combined to become a big omnibus bill that we're calling Justice and Policing Act 2020. It's got 9 major elements under which it's got several subheads. It is intended to end racial profiling and religious profiling, requiring training that needs to take place and accountability that needs to take place. It requires the collecting of data so that we know what kind of activities are taking place. It bans the things that we've been talking about, chokeholds, carotid holds, things of that nature. It bans the no-knock warrants that resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor. It limits the kind of military equipment that is being given to police, to local police, so that we can sort of diminish this sense of overly militarized police, law enforcing, and get back to some things like community policing and things of that nature. There are several accountability issues that are included in this bill. It eliminates qualified immunity so that police are held responsible, specifically, individually, for things that they might do, such as what we saw happening with Mr. Floyd. It changes the standards for prosecutors to be able to prosecute. It makes it easier for them to prosecute. The standard has been moved from reckless to, from willing willfulness to neglectful or negligent or recklessness, which is something harder for someone to defend. It empowers community programs. It puts grants into community programs. It tries to it suggests through things that we learned in the Obama 21st Century Police Report, the things that community organizations can do and can hold police forces accountable. And it puts grants associated with that. It requires that police are always wearing their cameras. It incentivizes local governments to do the very same thing, and state governments through funding or the lack of it, depending upon whether or not you want to adhere to the new laws. There's an establishment of a national directory of police who've been found to have shown misconduct in how they have used their power. And that directory is a national directory. It'll be a public directory. The purpose of it is to make sure that a police officer who's on that directory doesn't get hired in some of the jurisdictions and without knowing. And then, of course, that it makes lynching a federal crime. As it relates to the relationship between the federal government and the state and local governments, it is tied mostly to the funding that will or will not come forth to those entities, predicated upon whether or not they follow some of the mandates in this federal legislation as it principally applies to federal law enforcement. This is, I think, a pretty comprehensive, hopeful change the culture, change the accountability, change the kind of people that are recruited for policing in this country. But this is a response to an emergency situation. There's an urgency around this because what we saw was so stunning to us that we wanted to just stop. And so we want you to recognize that this is just a piece of the agenda, that there is another part of the Black Caucus agenda called Jobs and Justice, or Justice and Jobs. And it deals with the full range of things. It addresses some of the systemic racism that we've experienced that helped us to get to where we are today. And so it addresses housing discrimination, educational segregation implications, making sure that we try to disperse poverty. It addresses issues of social justice, dealing with over-criminalization of marijuana, the over-criminalization of African Americans, the over-incarceration of them. It deals with alternatives to sentencing. There's a bill that I'm really proud of that I support, which is ending the use of private prisons, because that's just an excuse for putting somebody someplace and creating another kind of cottage industry that's counterintuitive to who we should be and what we should be. So what you see in front of you right now that you see us talking about is all about the emergency situation. But that's not enough, because it doesn't deal with the things that have really undergirded the racism in this country, whether it is the concentration of poverty, the not building housing throughout municipalities so that young people can be educated in good schools that are not overly burdened by some of the social constructs that we see. There are issues of taking looking at how we imagine the role of police in our communities, how we look at resources being applied to community programs, to mental health programs. We need more counselors in schools, less resource officers in schools. And we need to look at the things like the over-disciplining of minority children, students in school, particularly girls, and what that's done to our communities. So there's an instant agenda, and you'll see that play itself out next week. Probably the week after we'll vote on it. Next week it'll actually be marked up in the Judiciary Committee. The following week we'll probably vote on it, and then it'll go to the Senate. And then we'll see what happens there. But it's a piece of legislation or an omnibus bill that deals with fairness and justice and accountability, and ought to be supported by everybody that's in Congress on both sides of the aisle and in both houses. And we need to use our collective voices all over the country with all the friends that we know to make sure that their voices are heard in support of this movement and this legislative package. So with that, I guess I took up my 5 minutes, and I'd be delighted to address some of the questions or engage in some of the conversations. But I am very proud of you all. I think that this is an absolutely wonderful thing. Your generation is so important. You look at the protests, and you see the diversity of the protesters and the persistence of the protests, and the notion that people outside of our country are even supporting these protests. And you look at it and you see young people and old people standing side by side. You see Black, white, Asian, Latino. You see gay, straight, young, and old. And I think that that's the signal that enough is enough in this country, and that people are willing to stand up. So your voice needs to be heard. Your vote needs to be felt. And your persistence, even after your voice is heard and your vote is cast, to hold whoever you supported accountable after the fact is vitally important. So I thank you for this invitation. And Jordan, I hand it back over to you.
So we have plenty of questions for you. So let's start with the first one. So this is from one of our other speakers. We have seen politicians as a whole react out of fear of consequence instead of doing what's right and on their own accord, and acting according to the times for a political self-interesting game. How do you suggest overcoming said philosophical conundrum and holding our elected officials accountable, especially if they are acclaimed salespeople who give baseless hope and false campaign promises on the campaign trail, or promises that they dissociate from upon taking office?
Well, I guess that goes to the point I talked about. Once you elect them, once you vote for them, as they get elected, they've got a responsibility to be held accountable, and you have to do that. So if an individual is seeking a re-election, look at that person's record and see whether or not that person has stood up for the issues that are important to you, and have advanced and advocated for the policies that you think create the kind of community at large that you want to see happen. And if that person has, you cast your vote for that person. If that person has not, you do not reelect that person. You look for an alternative to that person. If you are encountering a person who's running for the first time, and that person is queried in her or his campaign about the issues that you think are important, it's important for you to show up and ask them these questions. Then they get elected, you expect them to pay attention to what they're doing, and you expect them to be consistent with what it is that they said that they were going to do. And if they aren't, you don't give them a second term. But the issue here for me is that you don't ever just say, I did what I needed to do by voting. You have to keep all of us accountable. If you see something coming from me that you don't understand or you don't think you agree with, you need to be communicating with me about it to hear my perspective. Or maybe I need to hear yours and come to a different conclusion. But this is a participatory contract that we have in this democracy. And so from the supporting to the voting to the holding accountability are the things that we have to do. When you find out that someone has not fulfilled their obligation to you to the extent that is possible, because things don't just change in a day. There's a whole process, and I'm telling you, Congress on this particular omnibus bill is moving faster than I've ever seen it move on anything other than the coronavirus bills that we have passed in the last month and a half or 2 months. Things take time in some respects, but things are being dealt with, and it's with a sense of urgency right now. So it's about hold us accountable, kick us out if we're not doing what you think we should be doing.
How have you, in your time as Congresswoman, have been advocating for more radical reforms in the criminal justice system, whether it be reforming mandatory minimums offenses in New Jersey or ensuring policing is more equitable?
Thank you for that question, because this is an extension of the work that I did on the state legislature. I'm the House sponsor of an omnibus piece of legislation called the Next Step Act. The Next Step Act looks into things like the decriminalization of marijuana, the sentencing, over-sentencing, mandatory minimums, use of private prisons, alternatives to incarceration. If you're incarcerated, ensuring that you get access to education and your family, a whole host of things that are designed to recognize two things. One, if you don't belong in prison, you ought not be there. And two, but if you did something that requires your being in prison, then you're prepared to come back out at some point as a contributing citizen. And C, having a relationship with people that love you, like your family, is very important if you're separated from them. And so there are pieces in that particular legislation that say you don't assign a person to a prison that's 400 miles away from their family, that kind of thing. I have opposed mandatory minimums from the time I was in the state legislature, and I'm on every eliminate mandatory minimums bill that comes through the House. And I also won't vote for bills that happen to sneak mandatory minimum expansions in the bills. So my staff knows, pay particular attention when you're looking at legislation that is being recommended to us to see what it says about mandatory minimums. And I said I have a bill that says ban the use of private prisons, because I think that that's counterintuitive to the depopulation and the de-incarceration. And then I guess the other thing that I've been paying particular attention to is what happens to our children in schools, and how we have a tendency to be reacted to when we have an issue as being hostile, aggressive, and dangerous. And then we get disciplined and we get suspended, or we get referred to the juvenile court system. So I am a co-sponsor of legislation that we call Push Out, which deals with that whole issue. And there are a number of other initiatives that I've been working on, you know, like housing and things of that nature. I think housing is one of the most significant equalizers there is, because by dispersing housing and making sure that all communities have a bit of affordable housing, it gives children an opportunity to go to really good schools, like the schools you have in East Brunswick, and it diminishes the representation of poverty and what that means in terms of impact on systems, educational systems, social systems, and other systems.
This is another one from the live chat. What can we do as a community to support you and the positive legislation you've discussed, especially if we are not old enough yet to vote, as well as supporting the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole?
Thank you. You can certainly tell your parents about the legislation that you think that I am advocating for, that they should therefore support me. You should use your social media platforms to educate your friends on pieces of legislation or policies that are being advocated by me or anybody else that you think are important, that we need to educate people on. And you can, when it comes time for campaigning, although this is an interesting campaign that we have this time, is virtually virtual, you can engage in our campaign and spreading our word out to other people who might not otherwise know what I'm doing or are particularly interested, period, you know? But your voice is important, your volunteerism is important, and sharing what I'm doing and what you think I'm doing that is right. I also think that you need to be in touch with my office when you have a question about a position that we're proposing to take or a position that you would like us to take. We respond to our constituents, even those who can't quite vote yet. But as I said before, your generation is very important here. I mean, because you all have stood up in a way from Parkland on to this day in a way that young people, generations before that haven't. And that you've been consistent and persistent. And so you stand up every time you need to. And that is, I think, a signal to those who are elected that you've got accountability issues that you need to address, because young people are watching and they're engaging and they will collaborate with others who can and will vote.
All right. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Now, sadly, we do have to move on, although two excellent speakers coming up next to an interview between one of our previous speakers, Jerijah, and then our other speaker, Reggie Wright.
So I wanted to start by, we'll try to be, brief and, straightforward to the point. But can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, like where you're from, a little bit about your background, your schooling a little bit?
Yep. So born and raised in the city of Trenton, New Jersey, from a young buck to 17 years old. Graduated from high school there. Went through the parochial school. Let me back for a second. Grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, went through the parochial school system. Meanwhile, my grandmother, who primarily raised me, old lady from Mississippi, from Biloxi, Mississippi, raised me and nurtured me. She taught in the school system for 35 years. After raising her own two kids, she stepped in and helped raise me, sent me through the parochial school system, graduated from a parochial high school, went on to Jersey City, where I went to college in Jersey City. I obtained a bachelor's degree in Jersey City in computer science. I was there for a total of 5 years. Played basketball as a collegiate sport. After Jersey City, went on to play basketball overseas in Europe for a short period of time rather. Came back, transitioned into law enforcement, and also at the same time going back to school and earned a master's degree in arts and religion. Essentially, it's just a fancy way of having a degree that appeals to society more so than saying the master's in Bible.
Amazing. So I'm hearing that you're a cultured, well-rounded person, but I wanted to move in and kind of talk about that law enforcement piece. And I wanted to get your perspective on, as a Black man, as a person of color, and being belonging to our community and law enforcement community, how do you feel and how do you internally react when you see other officers, taking the lives of Black people, like, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, George Floyd, just, to name a few?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, I'm a Black man, right? Before I'm a law enforcement officer, I'm a Black man. And I understand what it's like to be Black in America. I think it was a Harvard professor that said on the 13th documentary on Netflix, that the reality is that no one that is white will ever understand what it's like to be a Black man in America. So when I see anything happening to a Black man, I definitely understand what that may be like or what someone may have went through. As a police officer, it's no different, right? It's no different. To me, humanity is humanity, right? We should care about people and treat them with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, creed, or color. Unfortunately, in our society, as we all know, the history has been explained for 2 hours now. There are some systemic problems that have occurred from the beginning of time. So when things happen to someone like George Floyd, which we all watch, live and up close with our own 2 eyes, it hurts me the same way it hurts my grandmother, the same way it should hurt a coworker, The same way that my 9-year-old son stood in front of me and cried, for a couple of minutes because of the pain that he felt watching this, happen. As a 9-year-old, he never thought that he would be watching something like this on live television. So the pain is real, for myself and others.
So I'm glad you were able to mention your son, because I remember growing up. I remember when Trayvon Martin was killed, and then my mom was like, "Yeah, you better not walk out this house with your hood on." I remember when I first started driving, my mom was like, "Okay, so when you get pulled over by a cop, this is how," so on and so forth. So what is that conversation like with your son? Raising a young Black king, like what do you tell him? What do you teach him as a Black father, but also as a police officer? Because not everybody is, like you. Not everybody has that cultural background. Not everybody understands the humanity of others and what they actually signed up for.
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, some of the nuances that have helped me, that have shaped and formed me throughout the city. I'm proud to be from the city. I'm proud how it raised me, the grind, the grit, the ability to persevere and have resilience. Has really helped shape me into the man that I am today. Obviously, just along with the grace of God. So when I think about my son, he's growing up differently than I did. We're growing. I didn't move too far from where I was raised. I'm actually right where Miss Watson went to high school at. So I didn't want to divorce myself from the community, so to speak, at large. I wanted to stay close and stay connected so I could be an influence. So when I think about my son, I think about how can I teach him and nurture him and guide him. So I have to talk with him the same way that most Black fathers have to talk with their kids. I have to talk with my son. He's 9. He's getting tall. In a couple of years, he may be 12 or 13, and he could be walking down the street, and someone could think that he's a 15 or 16-year-old that fits the description of a call that may have came in. I'm not naive to it. I don't think I'm immune to it just because I'm a police officer. I've had to talk. If you get stopped, keep your hands where they can see them. If you get stopped and you have ID in your pocket, make sure you verbally communicate, "I have identification in my pocket." If you have no identification, make sure you communicate your father's a law enforcement officer. He knows my name, he knows my phone number, he knows where I work. I've had the conversation with him. It doesn't mean that all cops are bad. It doesn't mean that police brutality exists in every single department throughout the nation. But I don't know who my son may come across. I don't know who may stop him and who may pull him over. So I've had to talk. I mean, that's just real.
I think it's just really interesting, and it ties into my next few points and questions. I think it's just really interesting that we even have to have, conversations like that, and feeling like, I walk out and it's like people they signed up to protect and to serve, and as a Black person or as a minority, sometimes I'm not always too trusting of that. So I think it's an interesting point. But a few things I kind of wanted to touch on. You mentioned 13th. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about some structural things, right? So the 13th Amendment, if you're not familiar, to the viewers, it states, in short, neither slavery or involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, wherefore the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within. All right, so according to the NAACP, this is my source of reference. Some facts and figures they provide is Black and Latino males make up 30% of the U.S. population, but 56% of incarceration. The U.S. is 5% of the world population, but 20% of the world prisoners, and Black are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites. So I kind of want to talk about what structural changes do you feel are sustainable. If you can kind of mix in, and kind of address the high school to prison pipeline we see in a lot of our young Black and Latino males, and some of the facts and figures I've provided.
Yeah. So in regards to like the structure, the policies, and procedures, I'm not really able to comment on that. I'm not in a position to really comment on it, just in light of the fact that I am obviously still working, even on behalf of police departments as I speak. I think some things need to happen, some changes need to occur. I think when you have systemic problems, you need systemic solutions, right? So obviously some changes need to occur. When I look at the school system, and stuff like that, I think you mentioned the school system. When I look at the school system, I just think about, listen, we have disenfranchised communities, and we know there's a history behind it. We know that the country was built upon slavery, and we know within that, we know at a point in time throughout history, those slaves were freed. Once they were freed, they were left with no land, no money, no resources, right? So we had people that went back to sharecropping, doing the very thing they were doing before when they were enslaved. Now they're doing it as free, but still essentially working for a landowner. That landowner is supposed to be sharing the crops, right? That's why it's called sharecropping. But in essence, you have someone like my grandmother, who was down in Mississippi, who's working on the field with her brothers, and she's taking care of the field, but yet she's not getting a piece of the share, right? She's told that I'll give you and your brothers a place to live. So when you see our generations pass on from generation to generation, we're starting over, right? We don't have the inheritance, we don't have the legacy that others have. So when I think about education, I think about how can I be a trailblazer. So my main function in community policing right now is I teach a character development curriculum in the schools, and I feel like if I can do anything, is get into the schools with these 610 students, whether they're Black, whether they're Latino, whether they're white, and just be a beacon of light. Let them see that an education is important. Let them see a Black man that has come from an inner city environment, that is well educated, that can articulate, conducts himself well. I'm imperfect. I will never be perfect, right? But someone that tries to do the right thing. And hopefully I can be a trailblazer for them so they understand the importance of good education. Because without education, obviously in our society, in our culture, the way the system is built, you're going to be left behind. And we can't necessarily depend on others to educate us or to inspire us to be educated. I feel like we need to inspire our own race of people to get an education.
Yeah. Powerful points you made. And I kind of wanted to have you speak to the point that some of us might feel, because you mentioned, not all cops are bad cops. I mean, obviously that remains to be true. But I think there are some of us who have that internal conundrum when it comes to, realizing that although that might be the case, but you're still a representative of a fractured criminal justice system as a whole. And not only that, I've even heard arguments where people are saying, okay, I understand that, but as a officer, there are just some professions or some careers where you cannot afford, certain mistakes or certain lack of accountability or, so on and so forth. So I kind of wanted to have a conversation with you about that, or what would you say to someone who's kind of dealing with that personal infliction when it comes to officers?
So deal with the affliction, the fact that I'm a Black man who's a law enforcement officer, you mean? With the fact that there's a distrust?
I think just in the whole argument in regards to, not all police officers are bad officers, but are still representatives, like physical representatives of a fractured criminal justice system that, like we see in the 13th Amendment, was still built to oppress Black people and slaves. And then we see the residual effects of that in 2020.
Right. So I think if you look at every career profession, I mean, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in every career profession, but I would assume Ms. Coleman knows the history behind what she's doing, and I'm sure she's been a trailblazer for many African-American women that aspire to do the same thing, and so forth and so on, whether it's a doctor, an engineer, a teacher, an administrator in whatever business career profession. Like, when you look throughout history, there has been oppression, right? There's been oppression. How have we made those changes over the course of the years? You and I talked offline a couple days ago. I use athletics. Obviously, I play basketball, so a lot of times I refer to that as an analogy. But when you look at the NBA, you look at baseball, you had the Negro League and you had the Major League. You look at somebody like Jackie Robinson, who I'm sure there was other Negro League players that were just as good as Jackie Robinson. But Jackie Robinson accepted the offer, went into the Major Leagues. He was oppressed. There wasn't equality. He had to stay in different hotels. He had to eat at different restaurants. He had his amenities were different. Everything was different for him. He understood that this was a way to pave the way for those that were coming behind him. So the system that was in place in the Major Leagues, the system that was in place in the National Basketball Association, the system that was in system to some degree that still is in place in, let's say, the National Football League, is still a system that's not in place for us to necessarily excel. But we have to infiltrate these careers and professions ourselves, right? To sit at the table, right? And make a way for those that's going to come behind us, along with changing certain policies and procedures. So I feel like, listen, when people they may look at me and think like you. The other day we talked offline. Oh, he's an Uncle Tom, or he's a sellout. I look at it like, not to me, the sellout is the person that becomes quote unquote successful in life, removes themselves from the inner city environment, and never comes back to help or try to help. Right? It's easy to just to give money, and we need that. But what about our time? What about our resource? What about our education? How can we give back? So when you look at the African American, whether it's a doctor, a lawyer, a judge, someone has been a trailblazer to help others get into that career profession. So I don't look at myself as someone that is putting on this uniform, and I represent the distrust that has occurred from years in the past. I put on this uniform and say, listen, I'm gonna go out and make a difference in the lives of people that I encounter. I look at it like an athlete. If you pay a ticket to go see a basketball game, you expect the best product when you show up that night. Doesn't mean they're gonna play well, but you expect them to give their all. When I encounter somebody in the traffic stop, in the schools, whatever the case may be, this may be their only encounter, maybe their first encounter with law enforcement. What kind of representation am I going to, leave with them? What kind of, do I want their perception to be, was he a nice guy? Was he a real one? Was he somebody I can talk to? Like, that's the thing for me. How am I going to treat people? What's my interactions like with them?
Yeah, so you actually, I was going to ask you that exact question because we're out of time, but you already answered it. Kind of taking that humanitarian approach to, when you have those interactions. I mean, yeah, it was Reverend Karen that mentioned earlier that, police officers don't necessarily want to be, social workers with the gun, but there is a certain approach that I'm glad to see that you're acknowledging that's important to take. So if you have any last things you want to say, I mean, that's it for my questioning, and then after that, I'll just turn it over to Jordan. But
yeah, I'll just comment on what you just said real briefly, and we can open up with questions. If there are any questions. When you come from where I come from, the old saying, when you have humble beginnings, when you remember the struggle was real. When I think about what my grandmother went through and how she worked as a teacher assistant, and then at night she went and cleaned homes in Princeton University, in Princeton, the township of Princeton. When I think about different struggles, I think about how people have paved the way for me to be in this situation that I am today. You have no choice but just to care about people. You have no choice because you understand that the things that have been granted to you, the place that you're in right now, is because of the struggle that someone else has went through, so that you can be in the spot that you're in. So to me, whether someone's black or white, Latino, Asian, it doesn't make a difference. Like, to me, people are people. Democrat, Republican, like, at the end of the day, these are people. And we need to treat people as such, whether you're a police officer or any other career profession.
Thank you. I'm glad that you were able to speak candidly. A lot of times we see people in the position of power like yourself, they aren't allowed to speak as candidly as you have been for whatever reason. So I'm grateful for you. Thank you.
Appreciate it, man. Yep.
Thank you. And Jordan, I personally yield over to you.
Thank you guys, both of you. That was a really great interview. And as I promised Ms. Hendricks earlier, we will be going back to questions for her. And if you guys have any more that you would like to keep asking, because I know we did cut that short, but we now have the time to do so. So Ms. Hendricks, if you're okay with answering some more questions, we can start that.
I am, and at any time any of the other panelists want to answer, that's fine by me.
Somebody asked if any of you guys believe that there is any feasible way that the 13th Amendment can be adjusted as to disallow slavery in all forms, even as punishment for a crime.
I will start by reminding us of what our Congresswoman said is part of what they are working on right now from the Congressional Black Congress. And I also want to reference back to something that I said. The NAACP started advocating for a federal anti-lynching law in 1909. We still don't have one. We are on the brink of having that anti-lynching law if we can get, I believe it's down to one senator. Congress, I believe, did pass. Yes, she's affirming. On the House side, on the Senate side, there's some debate over the term lynching. That's holding up the Senate. So understand how long it has taken just to get lynching recognized as an offense that the federal government should not be condoning. And then you add to it that there are many other types of slavery that occur in our country and in the world, that there will be, again, this tension about the definition of slavery. But I don't think we need to make that distinction. I believe any type of slavery, whether it's imprisoning young girls that are coming from a different country that are looking for, a better way, or if it's people who are not getting a fair salary for the work that they're performing, or any definition you want to give it. But as I mentioned to you earlier, chattel slavery is a particular heinous type of slavery that this country brought on our shores, and that we continue to have as that tension in terms of adjusting the institutional racism that is occurring in our country. So that's a long way of saying, okay, we'll see. Remember, the Civil Rights Act is an act since 1960, whatever it was, 8, 9. That still isn't legally signed into law. So I'm not sure. What do you think, Congresswoman Watson?
I think you pretty much covered the landscape here. I think that there is going to be ongoing discussions about how do we ensure that people have equity of opportunity and not just equality of opportunity. I think the whole issue of reparations is going to be a serious discussion. And what does that mean? And that's going to force a real conversation about the institution of racism, the systemic racism. It's been an uncomfortable conversation that we've tried to avoid, or just pick and choose pieces of it at a time. But now it's time to sort of rip the whole Band-Aid off of the whole range of issues. We should be examining, I think, the intentionality of policies and practices that impact our freedom to express and to be who we can be, predicated upon our being intellectually able, at working hard enough to do it. And so this, I believe, is a period of expansion of discussion, that we ought not lose the momentum of this occasion, and we need to leverage what we've seen to ensure that we are making sure that the entire expectation of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution apply to us equally. We still don't have an ERA amendment in the Constitution. Why is that such an issue? And so there are a lot of levels of conversation that are going to take place that I think address this whole notion of freedom. Freedom is the absence of any forced or artificial impediment or external impediment. So you should have the freedom to enjoy every single right that anybody else has, based upon your ability and your willingness to do and to be. And so this is an exciting time for all of us.
I have a question for you, Representative, if that's okay. That's okay, right, Jordan? Okay. So I kind of go back and forth in my head. Like, even now, listening to you talk, like, my head hurts, because I feel like there's so many of us new voters, right, or us young people, millennials, Gen Z alike, are frustrated with politicians, right? And that's just an irrefutable fact, right? So can you kind of talk or explain, especially me interning for, Joe Danielson, why is it so hard and convoluted for things to happen? Why is bipartisanship so complicated? Why do some politicians act in their own self-interest? Why do some politicians only act when it makes them look good, or it doesn't make them look good, or they make these baseless promises that they can't keep? Like, can you explain, and we have, as first-time voters, we have no problem voting, but can you kind of speak to some of our frustration when it comes to politicians, Democratic alike? And then you have politicians who get into office or turned off from office, people of color, but you have, politicians like Ross Baraka who are open and vocal, but then they get shut down and oppressed and slandered against for sticking up for their people righteously. So can you kind of speak with that internal struggle I've always had?
So we're all people with flaws, that's for sure. I think you got to know the motivation that a person has for offering themselves up for elective office. I see that as purposeful public service. I don't see that as an opportunity to get my headline out there or something of that issue. So when you encounter someone who just shows up when it's in his or her best interest, you don't support them. And you find people that are going to represent alternatives to them, and you support them. But you're talking about personal characteristics of individuals who happen to be politicians. And I think that just like we unfortunately sometimes give police a bad name because of what we're seeing, and so we indict the whole enforcement, the whole industry of law enforcement. That's what happens, I think, even with politicians. And in some ways, you see people using the word politician to sort of denigrate the person or the office that they're talking about. But we're supposed to be public servants. And so we're supposed to be there to support the issues that are important to the constituents that sent us there. And when you see something else, that's your space to get involved.
Can I chime in on that real quick? Not from the politician viewpoint, because I'm not a politician, but just as a police officer, or just as a man in general, I think she hit it right on the head, because I've always said, even when I go into schools, most parents, they preach, they want their kids to get excellent grades, right? If you reach the mark by getting the grade, then you're doing well. But you can be, I always say, I say this in the schools in East Brunswick, you could be an A student and be someone that has a horrible character, right? So it's all about character development. I always say this, listen, if you smoke weed poor, you're gonna smoke weed rich. If you're selfish, if you're just a selfish individual, you're gonna be selfish whether you're a politician, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a basketball player. So I think even with this stuff that's going on now, it's important to try to get the right people in place, whether it's politicians, police officers, firefighters, right? People that actually care about what they're actually supposed to be doing. If we're public servants and we're supposed to be serving the public, then you need to have people in place that have a heart for serving people, not just for the monetary gain, not just for the contractual agreement or the benefits. How do you do that though? How do you put a system in place that can weed out people? It's difficult. I know in New Jersey, New Jersey State Police, they have like a 5-year probationary period. Usually, for us, we have 1 year. Can you really tell a person's character truly in a year? Can someone fake it? Can you just put your best foot forward for a year? Think about a relationship between a husband and wife, a boyfriend and girlfriend. You put your best foot forward for a short period of time. Then why doesn't it work out? Because at some point in time, after that newness wears off, you see people's true colors. Their character comes out. It's no different, right? But there's so much that within the system that needs to be changed so that you can kind of weed that out, but you have to be able to get the people that's in positions to make the change. And hopefully there'll be myself and others like you guys that can help make these changes.
And can I say something about the system in general? Let me just talk about the system I work in. Because one of the things I think that frustrates young people is that things don't happen fast enough. That when you see wrong, it doesn't get corrected immediately. But good or bad, there are systems in place that you got to follow. One of the greatest frustrations I have is how long it takes me to go from an idea to get a bill done, to get a bill considered, to get a bill on the floor in a committee. There's a whole process. And some of that is good because it's, making sure you're not doing things hastily. You're doing things with great thought, and you're checking to see whether or not you're really accomplishing what it is you intended to accomplish. But Officer Wright hit it right smack dab in the middle of the target. And that is, it is about your reason for wanting to be whatever it is. It's about whether or not you've got the heart of a servant leader, or you've got the heart of a person who just wants to lead because he wants to see himself or herself in the limelight. And those are the decisions you make when you go to the polls, and those are the decisions that you continue to make as you stay engaged in. And I know I sound like a broken record. Accountability is really important.
So I would just like to thank everyone, our speakers, youth council members. I know I really pushed you guys through making this, and I'm sorry, but it was worth it. And to our audience members, thank you so much. I hope this was as great an experience for everyone here as it was for me. To those whom we have lost, rise in power. And remember, guys, the more you learn, the more you will be able to educate others. It is important to teach the young and call out others who should know better. And as Ms. Hendricks has stated earlier, and I will state it now, this conversation extends beyond those who agree with us. It goes out to the ignorant, biased, and bigoted. It's meant to make people feel uncomfortable because that's the start to change. So teach others that Black Lives Matter. We want to hear from you, and we want to keep doing this. Thank you all so, so much.